A powerful millionaire thought he had everything, until one shocking moment shattered his perfect world. When Ethan Walsh, a ruthless CEO, locked eyes with the three children he never claimed, his carefully constructed empire began to crumble. As secrets unravel and regrets surface, Ethan must fight for a second chance at fatherhood and forgiveness. Will he earn redemption or lose everything that truly matters? Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. I'd love to know. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next unforgettable story of love, loss, and hope. Ethan Walsh stepped off the gleaming private jet, the collar of his tailored charcoal coat turned up against the icy New York wind that barreled through the jet bridge. He barely registered the sting in his cheeks as he adjusted his cufflinks, focused instead on the string of notifications pinging on his phone. The quarterly earnings report had gone live 15 minutes ago, and already a dozen congratulatory messages from board members and opportunistic well-wishers clogged his screen. He exhaled, more weary than satisfied. Victories used to thrill him. Lately, they felt like boxes checked on an endless hollow list. His personal driver, an older man with a quiet demeanor Ethan appreciated, stood waiting by the terminal doors. But before Ethan could nod a greeting, the man's gaze flicked to the curb outside. Ethan followed the look, expecting nothing more than the usual blur of arriving passengers. Instead, his pulse snagged on a vision that split his composure wide open. A long black limousine pulled up, engine idling in the hush before the crowds pressed closer. The tinted window rolled down, and he saw her, Camille. Her profile, the delicate slope of her jaw, the way her dark hair swept over her shoulder, it all rushed back like a wave he'd been too proud to admit he missed. She stepped onto the sidewalk, and in that instant, every detail embedded itself in his memory with punishing clarity. The sheen of her navy wool coat, the bright scarf knotted at her throat, the calm assurance in her posture. She had always carried herself like she knew exactly who she was, even when he hadn't. His breath clouded in front of him as he took a step closer to the glass doors. He hadn't laid eyes on her in nearly 6 years, not since the day he'd walked out of their townhouse and into the sleek black sedan that symbolized everything he thought he wanted: prestige, freedom, control. He'd told himself it was better that way. He'd told himself she deserved someone who would choose her over ambition. But in truth, he hadn't given her the chance to choose him at all. He swallowed, trying to gather the frayed edges of his pride as she turned, scanning the curb. The door behind her opened, and for a moment he braced for some faceless assistant or perhaps a new partner. What emerged instead knocked the air from his lungs. 3 small figures clambered out, each bundled in thick winter coats, hats pulled low over shining eyes that peered around with innocent curiosity. A little boy with hair the color of midnight, a little girl with soft brown curls escaping her beanie, and another boy whose grin was so familiar it felt like a punch to Ethan's chest. Triplets. He knew it without question, just as surely as he knew the marrow in his bones belonged to the same lineage. A rush of memories collided. Camille cradling the small swell of her belly, the arguments about timing, about how children would derail the plans he'd been so determined to protect. He believed she would be better off without him. But standing here, watching her shepherd those children into a semblance of order, he understood he hadn't left for her sake. He'd left because he was terrified he'd never measure up. His heart thudded, slow and ragged, as Camille bent to straighten the smallest boy's scarf. Her gloved hand brushed his cheek, and he leaned into her touch with perfect trust. Ethan pressed a palm to the cold glass door. The boy's eyes darted up as if sensing him, and for a heartbeat that stretched impossibly long, their gazes locked. There was something startling in that look, some recognition Ethan couldn't bear to examine too closely. It was the same expression he saw in the mirror before every shareholder meeting, a yearning to be enough. The terminal around him stirred back to life. Paparazzi, drawn by the rumor of his return and his engagement to Vivienne Hart, began to materialize near the exit. Their cameras flashed in eager anticipation. A security guard murmured something into his radio. Ethan knew he had to move. He had to reclaim his mask of composure before the vultures smelled blood. But his feet felt cemented to the polished floor. Camille didn't appear to notice the small commotion. She ushered the children into a neat line, their small hands clasping hers and each other's as they waited for the chauffeur to unload their luggage. The little girl turned to point at something behind Ethan, some Christmas display he hadn't even noticed. And when Camille glanced over her daughter's shoulder, her gaze landed on him. It was like being flayed alive. She didn't startle. She didn't look away. The years that had settled in the fine lines at the corners of her eyes did nothing to blunt the power of that look. Calm, resigned, unimpressed by the empire he'd built or the headlines he'd dominated. For a flickering second, he thought she might smile, might acknowledge some small flicker of shared history. Instead, she gave the smallest nod, more courtesy than recognition, and turned back to the children. He felt the burn of humiliation creep up the back of his neck. Once she'd loved him so fiercely he'd been afraid of it. Now she looked at him like he was a stranger. And perhaps he was. In all the ways that mattered. A throat cleared behind him, snapping the spell. Ethan turned to find Vivienne striding up in her high-heeled boots, a perfect storm of polished chic and steely curiosity. Her gaze flicked between Camille and the children, then back to Ethan, narrowing with calculating interest. "You're staring," she said, voice soft but edged. "Old friend of yours?" He tried to speak, but the words lodged behind his teeth like stones. Vivienne tilted her head, studying the children. She had a way of appraising everything, people, opportunities, threats, with the same cool detachment. "They look familiar," she mused. "Someone you worked with?" The question hovered like a test, one he was too shell-shocked to answer. Instead, he looked back at Camille, willing her to look at him again, to give him something, anger, warmth, anything to tether him to the life he'd abandoned. But she was already climbing into the limousine, her children following in practiced order. The door shut with a soft finality that made his stomach twist. Vivienne's hand slid into the crook of his elbow, her red manicured nails sharp against his coat. "Ethan," she prompted. "Who is she?" The limo eased away from the curb, gliding past them as if he were invisible. Inside, the children pressed their faces to the tinted glass, watching the terminal fade behind them. The little girl lifted a mittened hand and waved. For a split second, Ethan thought she was waving at him. But her gaze drifted past, toward the enormous Christmas tree twinkling in the atrium. He swallowed the ridiculous ache in his throat. He turned to Vivienne, who was waiting with the unspoken expectation that he would explain this away. Spin it. Diminish it. But as he watched the taillights disappear into traffic, he knew there was no version of this story that could be smoothed over. No convenient narrative that would erase the truth of what he'd seen. "Someone I knew a long time ago," he finally said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Vivienne's eyes searched his face, her expression a careful balance between curiosity and suspicion. She opened her mouth to probe further, but Ethan lifted a hand to silence her. He couldn't do this here, not with cameras still lurking, not with his chest cracked open and raw. Without another word, he stepped past her, striding toward the escalator as if he could outpace the tidal wave he felt rising behind his ribs. Each step felt heavier than the last. He thought of all the years he'd spent chasing acquisitions, mergers, the next rung on an endless ladder. He thought of the sterile hotel rooms, the glass offices that smelled of fresh-cut flowers and polished ambition, the carefully curated life that had no room for warmth. And then he thought of Camille, standing in the winter chill with her children pressed close. A picture of everything he'd convinced himself he didn't need. Outside, the limo was long gone. But in his mind, he could still see the way the little boy had looked at him. Like he'd been waiting for Ethan all along. He pressed his hand to his chest as if he could steady the strange, painful rhythm of his heart. In the corner of his vision, Vivienne was saying something to the driver, her face pinched in irritation. The cameras were shifting focus now, tracking some celebrity disembarking from first class. He could have slipped away unnoticed. But even as he forced himself to move forward, he knew that moment on the curb had altered something in him so irrevocably that no amount of pretense could ever put it back the way it was. As he walked into the terminal, the garlands overhead blurred. He didn't know if it was fatigue or something more treacherous rising behind his eyes. He'd built an empire to prove he mattered. But as the door swung shut behind him, Ethan Walsh faced the dawning certainty that all he'd built was hollow, without the very thing he'd so carelessly left behind. Ethan didn't remember the ride home. He sat in the back of the SUV, staring out the tinted window as the city blurred past in streaks of gray and amber. Every once in a while, Vivian's reflection flickered across the glass, her eyes flicking from her phone to him, her lips pursed in silent assessment. She didn't ask more questions, and he was grateful for the temporary reprieve. His mind felt splintered, 1,000 brittle shards he didn't know how to gather. By the time the car pulled into the underground garage beneath his building, he still hadn't spoken a word. The driver climbed out to open the door, but Ethan raised a hand, signaling him to wait. He needed a moment, a breath. A chance to piece together what had detonated inside him the instant he'd seen Camille and those children. Even thinking the phrase, "those children," made his heart lurch like he'd stepped off a precipice he'd never noticed at his feet. Vivian sighed, smoothing her sleek hair behind her ear. "If you want me to leave you alone tonight, just say it." He didn't answer, though he could feel her gaze searching his profile. She had a knack for identifying leverage points, those soft hidden places that made men easier to manage. He suspected she was cataloging his reaction now, deciding how best to spin it later. It made him tired to even think about it. "I'll be upstairs," she said finally, her voice clipped. "Call me when you've—" She didn't finish. The door clicked shut behind her, her high heels tapping briskly away into the elevator lobby. Ethan pressed his head back against the seat. His throat felt scraped raw. He'd told himself for years that the past was over, that Camille had chosen to let go just as he had. He'd imagined her moving on, maybe marrying someone steady, someone who wanted the things she did: family, warmth, children. A life that didn't revolve around quarterly projections. He had never once imagined she would raise their children alone, or that he would be so spectacularly blind to it. He exhaled shakily and finally stepped out into the cavernous garage. The elevator ride to the penthouse was mercifully silent. As the doors parted on polished marble floors and soaring glass walls, he was struck by how sterile it all looked. Every sleek line, every curated object reminded him that this place had been built as a testament to his success, and nothing more. There were no pictures on the walls, no stray toys tucked into corners, no evidence that anyone had ever really lived here. He walked through the foyer, past the sculpture Vivian had commissioned, a twisting column of steel that was supposed to symbolize ambition, and paused at the bar. For the first time in months, he poured himself a drink. The whiskey burned down his throat, and he welcomed the way it scoured the tightness in his chest. But it did nothing to quiet the barrage of memories clawing their way to the surface. Camille's laugh, soft and a little shy, the first time he'd invited her to dinner. The way her face lit up when she spoke about teaching. She'd always said the world didn't need more CEOs, it needed more people willing to care. The nights they'd spent curled together on their sagging couch in Brooklyn, dreaming about the future. Back when he still believed success would be the reward that made everything else worthwhile. And then, the day he'd left. He could still see her standing in the doorway, one hand resting protectively over the small swell of her belly, her dark eyes searching his for something. Remorse, second thoughts, love. He hadn't given her any of it. He'd been too afraid of what it would mean to stay. Afraid that he'd fail her, that he'd fail their child, that the man he was striving to become couldn't coexist with the man she needed. So he'd walked away. He'd convinced himself it was better to make a clean break than to stay and watch everything unravel. His glass hit the counter with a hollow clink. He pressed both hands against the polished surface, shoulders bowed. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. It pressed against his ears, amplifying the soft echo of his ragged breathing. For years he'd told himself he didn't look back. That regret was for weaker men. But standing here, haunted by the memory of Camille's eyes and the shape of that little boy's face, he felt like the weakest man alive. He tried to shake himself free of it. He was Ethan Walsh, the man who had turned a failing logistics startup into a multinational powerhouse. The man whose face graced the covers of business magazines. The man who'd clawed his way up from nothing, who had never once let sentiment derail his plans. But the truth was, sentiment was all he had left now. The realization landed so hard it left him breathless. Everything else, the empire, the money, the pristine skyline view, felt like an elaborate facade erected to distract him from the simple, aching fact that he had once been loved. Truly loved. And he had walked away from it. Somewhere in the penthouse, Vivienne's phone chimed with a reminder. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, then turned and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered in the winter darkness, each light a testament to ambition. It should have comforted him. Instead, it looked as empty as he felt. He thought of Camille again. Her expression as she turned from him outside the airport, steady, unflinching, completely unafraid of who she was without him. He had spent 6 years convincing himself she was weaker for wanting a life he couldn't give her. But tonight, he finally saw the truth. She had always been stronger. She hadn't needed him to validate her worth. She hadn't needed him to define her family. She had built it without him. And he had nothing but this silent penthouse to show for all his victories. He let the memories play, punishing himself with every detail. The first time she'd told him she was pregnant, her voice trembling with equal parts joy and terror. He'd frozen, unable to summon the words she needed to hear. That he loved her, that he was proud, that he would figure it out with her, no matter what. Instead, he'd retreated into the only language he knew: logic, planning, contingencies. He'd told her they needed to wait, that the timing was wrong, that their lives weren't ready for children. She had cried that night, curled into the corner of the bed while he stared at the ceiling, feeling like a coward. Even now, the memory made his throat close. He'd promised her it wasn't that he didn't want children. It was that he wanted to give them everything. Stability, security, a life free from the chaos he'd endured growing up. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been terrified. Terrified of becoming his father, a man who'd abandoned responsibility the second it demanded sacrifice. And in trying so hard not to repeat his father's mistakes, he had made his own. Different in shape, but every bit as devastating. His phone buzzed against the countertop, snapping him out of the spiral. He glanced at the screen, expecting a text from Vivienne or a notification about the stock price. Instead, it was a single, unassuming email. The subject line read simply, request for records. His chest tightened. He opened it, skimming the terse lines, confirming what he already knew in his gut. 3 birth certificates attached. Mason Ethan Rivers, Mia Camille Rivers, Max Julian Rivers, born 5 years ago, all bearing his name on the father line. He closed his eyes as the final barrier crumbled. There was no room left for denial. Those children were his. For a long moment, he stood there, phone in hand, the city glittering cold and indifferent behind him. He wondered if Camille had ever tried to tell him directly. If she'd reached out in the early days and been shut down by the wall of assistance he'd built around himself. The thought hollowed him out. He replayed every conversation they'd ever had about the future, every argument that ended with her saying, "Someday you'll understand what you're giving up." At the time, he'd called her melodramatic. He'd told himself she was clinging to something outdated, something small. But standing here, alone in the penthouse that smelled faintly of expensive polish and nothing else, he finally understood. She hadn't been trying to trap him. She'd been trying to save him from this. A tight, painful laugh scraped his throat. He had been so certain he was the one making the sacrifice, that he was the noble one, leaving to spare her disappointment. The reality was far simpler. He had left because he was a coward who didn't know how to love anyone more than he loved his own ambition. He set the phone down and braced his hands on the counter. The surface was cool beneath his palms, solid in a way nothing else felt right now. His heart thumped painfully, each beat a reminder that no amount of success could ever fill the hollow where love should have been. At last, he lifted his head, staring at his reflection in the darkened glass. The man who looked back at him was impeccably groomed, composed, a symbol of everything he'd achieved. But for the first time, Ethan could see through the facade. Behind the polished exterior, he looked tired, older than his years, and, most of all, alone. And for the first time in a very long time, he let himself feel every drop of regret he'd spent years outrunning. The following afternoon, Ethan stood on the sidewalk in front of a red brick brownstone in Brooklyn, feeling more like an intruder than he ever had in any hostile boardroom. He'd spent the morning trying to draft an email to Camille, something composed and dignified that would protect them both from the mess of raw emotions simmering beneath his skin. But no combination of words looked right on the screen. Every sentence was either too cold or too desperate. In the end, he had closed his laptop and simply gotten in the car. Some truths couldn't be managed through a polished paragraph. They had to be faced head-on. Now that he was here, his certainty was bleeding out of him with every passing second. He shifted on his feet, glancing up at the tidy rows of windows. A paper snowflake was taped to the glass of one, and he couldn't help wondering which of the children had made it. Mason, with the dark, serious eyes? Mia, whose little face was so like Camille's it made his throat ache? Or Max, the boy who had looked at him with a curiosity that still burned under his ribs? He shoved his hands into the pockets of his coat and drew a slow breath. He wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here for answers. For years he'd believed he was the wronged party, abandoned by a woman who refused to understand the demands of his life. But yesterday's revelations had cracked that self-righteous illusion clean in half. If Camille had tried to tell him, and he had ignored her, then he wasn't the victim of anything but his own arrogance. He reached out and pressed the doorbell before he could lose his nerve. A muffled chime rang inside, and he heard the distant patter of feet. For a brief, ridiculous moment, he imagined Camille would open the door and smile, some warmth in her eyes to reassure him they could find common ground. He'd been rehearsing apologies all night, trying to mold them into something worthy of her forgiveness. The door swung open, and all his rehearsed lines vanished like smoke. Camille stood framed in the doorway, wearing a deep green sweater and jeans, her hair gathered in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She looked exactly the same and completely different. Time had left its quiet signatures, a new softness at the edge of her eyes, a steadiness in her expression he didn't remember. She didn't look surprised to see him. She didn't look angry either. If anything, she looked tired. "Ethan," she said evenly. No inflection, no invitation. He swallowed. "Hi." Her gaze flicked to the street behind him, as though expecting cameras or an entourage. When she didn't see either, she leaned a shoulder against the frame. "I wondered how long it would take you." There was no malice in her tone, which made it worse somehow. He realized he would rather she slam the door in his face than greet him with this quiet, impersonal calm. "Can I come in?" he asked, aware of how small his voice sounded. Camille hesitated for a long moment. Then she stepped back and gestured him inside. The air in the foyer was warm, scented faintly of vanilla and something savory. Soup, maybe? A basket of children's shoes was tucked on a narrow bench, and a row of hooks held 3 small coats in bright colors. He stared at them as if they were artifacts of a life he'd never imagined. In a way, they were. "Where are they?" he asked before he could stop himself. "At a friend's," Camille said. She closed the door gently and turned to face him. "I thought this might happen. I didn't think it was fair to have them here." A beat of silence stretched between them. Ethan's eyes dropped to the floor. "I'm not here to fight." "That's good," she said, "because I'm too tired for that." He lifted his gaze, searching her face for any trace of the woman who used to love him. He could still see hints of her, the curve of her mouth, the quiet strength in her eyes. But there was no softness now, no tender ache that might have made this easier. "I didn't know," he said finally. It was all he could manage, 3 words that felt pathetically inadequate. Camille's eyebrows rose slightly. "Didn't know what exactly? That you had children? Or that you left before you were ready to face it?" He winced. "I'm not making excuses." "Good," she said again. She crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze level. "Because there aren't any." He nodded, his throat tightening. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations. He hadn't prepared for this quiet, unshakable certainty. She had built a life without him, and she didn't need his validation for any of it. "I just need to know," he said, voice rough. "Did you try to tell me?" Her expression didn't change. "Of course I did." A dull roaring started in his ears. "When?" 6 months after you left," she said. "I called, I emailed, I even sent a letter to your office. I thought you deserved to know, that they deserved to be known." His stomach lurched. He could picture it all too easily. his assistant screening his calls, deleting the messages she deemed unimportant, dropping the letter in a pile he never touched. He pressed a hand to his forehead. I didn't see any of it. I know, she said softly. It was easier for you that way. Her voice wasn't unkind. That was the worst part. She wasn't trying to wound him. She was simply telling the truth. He had built a fortress around his life, so nothing could distract him from his goals. He hadn't realized he'd also locked out every chance to be a father. I'm sorry, he whispered, and it felt like the most honest thing he'd said in years. Camille's mouth curved, not quite a smile. I know you are. A silence settled between them, heavier than before. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Ethan let his gaze drift around the small living room beyond the foyer. It was simple and warm. Soft couches, a scattering of picture books, framed photos on the mantel. He caught glimpses of the triplets at various ages. Mason scowling at a birthday cake, Mia clutching a stuffed rabbit, Max grinning with a missing tooth. He felt a strange mix of longing and shame, as though he were trespassing in a story he'd forfeited the right to read. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice low. I know I don't deserve it. Camille tilted her head, studying him. This isn't about forgiveness, Ethan. It's about them. They're your children. They deserve better than whatever this is. He swallowed. I want to be part of their lives. Her eyebrows lifted. Now? Yes. The word came out fierce, unsteady. I should have been there from the start. I can't undo that, but I can be here now. Camille drew a slow breath as though weighing something in her mind. It's not that simple. I know, he said quickly. I know it isn't, but I'm not walking away again. Her gaze softened just slightly. Do you even know them? Do you know their names? He felt his throat tighten. Mason? Mia? Max? Her eyes flickered, the first real crack in her composure. They're good kids, smart, kind. I've tried to raise them without bitterness. I can see that, he said quietly. You've done an incredible job. She looked away, her mouth pressing into a thin line. For a moment, he thought she might cry. But when she looked back at him, her expression was calm again. Why now? She asked. After all this time, why suddenly decide you care? He thought about lying, about spinning some story that would make him look less pitiful. But he was so tired of half-truths, so tired of pretending he was someone who didn't bleed when she looked at him like this. Because yesterday I saw them, he said simply. And for the first time in years, I realized I've been lying to myself. I've built everything I ever thought I wanted, and it's nothing without them. Camille studied him for a long moment. Then she walked past him into the living room and returned with a manila envelope. She held it out, her fingers steady. These are the DNA tests. I had them done years ago, in case you ever decided to show up. He took the envelope with hands that didn't feel like his own. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She interrupted gently. Because I knew someday you'd come back, and I knew you'd need proof before you let yourself feel anything. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The weight of her quiet certainty left him raw. She drew in a measured breath. I'm not going to keep them from you, but I'm also not going to let you waltz in and disrupt everything we've built. If you want to be their father, you'll have to earn it. He nodded slowly, his chest aching. I understand. Camille's gaze held his, clear and unflinching. Do you? Because this isn't about you. It's about them. Their security. Their happiness. I know, he whispered. For the first time since he'd rung the doorbell, her expression softened. Then we'll start there. A fragile hope stirred in him, delicate as a sapling pushing through frozen earth. He knew it would take time. He knew he would have to prove himself, over and over. But as he looked at her, this woman he had once loved, maybe still loved in some hidden corner of his heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He glanced down at the envelope in his hands, then back at her. Thank you, he said, and he meant it. Camille didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Go home, Ethan. Think about what you really want. He nodded, backing toward the door. As he stepped outside into the cold, he felt the weight of 6 lost years pressing down on him. But beneath the regret was something steadier, something like resolve. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Ethan barely slept that night. He sat alone in the study, the envelope of DNA records propped on the polished walnut desk as if it were a sentinel bearing witness to his failings. Now and then he reached out to touch it, to remind himself it was real. That they were real. Mason. Mia, Max. He said their names out loud until they felt less like strangers and more like some tether he hadn't even realized he was searching for. At dawn, he rose from the chair, his body aching with exhaustion that went deeper than fatigue. He showered and dressed mechanically, his mind already moving ahead to the conversations he dreaded most. Camille had been right. This wasn't about him. But to do right by his children, he had to own the wreckage he'd left behind. The first step was Vivienne. When he stepped into the kitchen, she was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a mug of coffee cupped in her manicured hands. She was dressed immaculately, as always, a white blouse tucked into tailored slacks, her hair pinned in a sleek twist. She didn't turn to look at him when he entered. Instead, she kept her gaze on the skyline, the silence between them already heavy with everything they hadn't said. "I didn't realize you'd be up this early," he said carefully. Vivienne lifted the cup to her lips, sipping before she replied. "I couldn't sleep." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. He crossed to the counter, picking up the tablet she'd left there. The screen glowed with headlines in crisp, merciless font. Millionaire CEO's secret family exposed. Ethan Walsh. The children he never claimed. Who is Camille Rivers? He set the tablet down, every muscle in his body tensed. "You saw it." "Of course I did," she said coolly, finally turning to face him. "Everyone saw it." He raked a hand through his hair. "I didn't want this. I swear to you, Vivienne, I didn't know. I'm not interested in your excuses." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were bright with something sharper than anger. "Do you have any idea what this does to us? To the merger negotiations? The investors are already calling. The board wants answers." He closed his eyes, feeling the ground tilt beneath him. "I'll handle it." "How?" she demanded, her composure cracking for the first time. "How are you going to fix this? You think some statement is going to make it disappear? That you can spin this like you spin every other mistake?" "I'm not trying to spin it," he said, his voice low. "I'm trying to own it." Her laugh was brutal. "Own it? You can't even say the words." He looked at her, the woman he'd thought he could build a life with, and saw how little of himself he'd ever truly shared. For months, he'd been living in a performance, smiling for the cameras, making plans he wasn't sure he believed in, telling himself that ambition was enough. But Camille had been right. Ambition without purpose was just vanity dressed in a suit. "They're my children," he said finally, the words tasting both foreign and inevitable. "All three of them." Vivienne's lips parted, but no sound came out. For a long moment, she just stared at him, as though she were trying to reconcile this man with the one she thought she knew. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet. "Do you love her?" she asked. He hesitated. It would have been easy to lie, to reassure her that there was nothing left between him and Camille, but obligation. But he was so tired of lying, to himself, to everyone. "I don't know," he admitted. "What I know is that I love them, and I can't pretend they don't exist." She turned back to the window, her shoulders rigid. "So what happens now?" "I don't expect you to decide anything today," he said gently, "but I have to be part of their lives. That's not negotiable." Vivienne drew a trembling breath. "And the IPO? The press? You think you can juggle it all and still play family man?" "I don't know," he repeated, "but I'm going to try." Her silence was worse than yelling. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "I think you should stay somewhere else for a while." He nodded slowly. "I understand." She didn't look at him again. He left the kitchen, each step feeling like the closing of a door he wasn't sure he'd ever open again. By midday, his phone was vibrating non-stop, calls from board members, his attorney, the PR team, and a handful of journalists sniffing around for comment. He ignored them all. Instead, he called Camille. She picked up on the third ring, her voice wary. "Hello?" "It's me," he said. "I need to see you." She sighed softly. "Ethan, I'm not here to cause problems," he interrupted. There are things we need to talk about them." A pause, then finally, "All right, this afternoon." He exhaled, relief and dread tangling in his chest. "Thank you." At 4 o'clock, he stood again on her stoop, a manila folder clutched in his hand. Camille opened the door with the same guarded calm, and he knew she'd been watching the news too. She led him into the living room without a word. The children weren't there. He wondered if she'd sent them to a neighbor again, shielding them from the spectacle he'd brought to their doorstep. He sat on the edge of the sofa, feeling clumsy in a space that hummed with warmth and order. Camille perched on the armchair across from him, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm sorry for the attention," he began, his voice rough. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "No," she said evenly, "it isn't." He swallowed. "I'm trying to do this right, but I don't even know what that looks like." She studied him, her eyes clear and unflinching. "It looks like consistency. It looks like showing up. It looks like putting them first, even when it's inconvenient." He nodded, his throat tight. "I can do that." "Can you?" she asked softly. "Because they've been fine without you. You don't get to waltz in and play the hero." "I know," he whispered. "I don't want to be the hero. I just want to be their father." Something flickered in her expression. Grief, maybe, or the ghost of hope. She looked away, her gaze settling on the photos lining the mantel. "They're good kids," she said quietly. "They deserve better than this circus." "I agree." Silence unfurled between them, heavy with everything neither of them wanted to say. At last, she gestured to the folder in his hand. "What's that?" "Financial records," he said. "Trusts, insurance policies. I'm not trying to buy my way into their lives, but I want to make sure they're secure." She accepted the folder without comment, flipping it open. Her eyes skimmed the documents, her expression unreadable. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, voice low, "but I want to be here, however you'll allow it." Her gaze lifted, steady and searching. "And Vivienne?" "She knows," he admitted. "I'm staying somewhere else for now." Camille nodded slowly, as if she'd expected nothing less. "This isn't going to be easy." "I know," he said again. She closed the folder and set it on the coffee table. "Mason asks about you," she murmured. "He saw you at the airport. He said you looked sad." He felt something splinter deep inside him. "I was." She studied him for a long moment. "They're at Emma's house. If you want to meet them properly, you can stay. I'll go get them." He swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said softly. "But just for a little while, one step at a time." He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Camille stood and walked to the door, pausing as if she might say something more. But then she slipped into her coat and stepped out into the cold. Ethan was left alone in her living room, staring at the photos that told the story he'd missed. A story he hoped, God, he hoped, he might still have time to join. His phone buzzed again on the coffee table. This time he picked it up. It was his PR manager, her messages stacked in neat rows. "Call me. We need to issue a statement. Call me. Investors are threatened to pull funding. Call me." He silenced the phone, turning it face down. For the first time in years, he understood that some things couldn't be managed. Some things could only be earned. Minutes later, the front door opened again. Camille stepped in, her cheeks flushed from the wind. 3 small faces peeked around her legs, their eyes wide and curious. Mason stood in front, his jaw set in a tiny echo of Ethan's own stubbornness. Mia clutched Max's hand, her gaze flicking nervously between her mother and this stranger in their living room. Ethan rose slowly, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break his ribs. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if any words could possibly be enough, so he dropped to one knee, bringing himself level with them. "Hi," he said hoarsely. You're my dad," Mason said, his voice small but steady. Ethan's vision blurred. He nodded, unable to speak. Mason studied him for a moment, then took a tentative step forward. Mia followed, her eyes round as moons. Max hung back, his thumb creeping into his mouth. And just like that, Ethan Walsh understood that every acquisition, every headline, every hollow victory had been leading him here, to this quiet, ordinary living room, to 3 children he didn't deserve and loved more than he had words to explain. Camille watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. But when Ethan finally looked up, she didn't look away. And in her eyes, he thought he saw the faintest glimmer of something that almost felt like forgiveness. Ethan sat at the long oak conference table in the family court mediation room, the knot in his stomach tightening each time the door opened and someone new stepped inside. Outside the narrow windows, snow was beginning to drift in lazy spirals over the courthouse parking lot, blanketing the cars and sidewalks in a quiet hush. Inside, though, the air was taut with the promise of conflict. He could feel it radiating off Camille where she sat across from him. her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't looked at him since she'd walked in. Not once. Beside her, a woman in a navy pantsuit set down a stack of documents, her attorney, a composed, competent presence, whose expression made it clear she took no pleasure in being here, but would not hesitate to dismantle Ethan if necessary. On his side of the table, his own counsel adjusted her glasses and gave him a small, bracing nod, as if to remind him he had every right to be here. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in this room, that this was the consequence he'd earned by abandoning his family before it had even begun. The door opened again, and the mediator entered, a middle-aged man with silver hair and kind eyes. He settled into the chair at the head of the table, greeting each of them in turn with a soft-voiced professionalism that only underscored how serious all of this was. "Mr. Walsh," he began, folding his hands, "I understand you've requested this mediation to establish formal custody and visitation agreements." Ethan cleared his throat, forcing his voice past the tightness in his chest. "Yes, I want to be involved in their lives in whatever way is best for them." The mediator nodded thoughtfully. "Ms. Rivers, do you agree that a structured plan is appropriate at this time?" Camille's lawyer leaned in to murmur something, and Camille's jaw tensed. She inhaled slowly before answering. "I think structure is necessary," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I want my children to have clarity. They need to know what to expect, what they can rely on." Ethan swallowed. "I want that too." "Then we'll begin by discussing legal acknowledgement," Camille's lawyer said crisply, flipping open a folder. "While the paternity tests are conclusive, your name is not listed on their birth certificates. We will be petitioning the court to amend them." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Of course. And child support," she continued, her pen already poised above a legal pad. "Your financial obligations will be calculated based on income and assets." "That's fine," he said quietly, "anything they need." Camille's eyes flickered up for the first time, studying him with an inscrutable expression. He tried not to flinch under her gaze. He didn't deserve her grace, but he also knew he had to stand here and take the full weight of his failings. That was the only way any of this could be redeemed. The mediator spoke again. "Have you both considered the emotional impact of this transition on the children?" Camille's hands clenched together. "Yes," she said after a moment. "They've had stability. I don't want that disrupted." "I understand," Ethan said quickly. "I'm not here to take them away from you." "But you are here to claim them," she replied, her voice soft but unflinching. "You're here to plant your flag after 5 years of silence." Her words stung because they were true. He didn't try to argue. "I am," he admitted. "But I'm not expecting them to see me as their father overnight. I'm willing to go as slow as you need, as they need." The mediator glanced between them. "Miss Rivers, would you be amenable to a graduated visitation schedule? Supervised at first, progressing to unsupervised as the children become comfortable." Camille closed her eyes briefly as if steadying herself. When she opened them, she nodded. "Yes, that seems fair." Her lawyer began outlining the terms. Bi-weekly supervised visits in a neutral location, gradually increasing in frequency if all went well. Ethan listened carefully, memorizing every detail. He didn't protest, didn't push for more. He was prepared to earn every hour he spent with them. When the mediator asked if there were any objections, Camille hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "I only ask that the press be kept out of this," she said quietly. "They're just children. They don't deserve to have cameras shoved in their faces because of your reputation." Ethan felt a fresh wave of shame. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect them," he said. "I can issue a statement, set boundaries with the media." "Words don't matter if your actions don't match," she said, her voice low. "You don't get to play the devoted father in public and disappear again when the headlines fade." He flinched but nodded. "I won't. I swear it." The mediator's pen scraped across the page. "Then we'll document the agreement accordingly." The rest of the meeting blurred around the edges. Legal language and procedural steps washed over Ethan in a dull current as he signed document after document. With each signature, he felt something loosening in his chest, a burden he'd carried so long he hadn't realized how much it weighed. For the first time, he was committing to something that wasn't about profit margins or quarterly growth. He was committing to them, to the tiny, astonishing humans he'd helped bring into the world. When it was over, Camille rose first, gathering her coat around her. Her lawyer touched her elbow briefly, murmuring something he didn't catch, and stepped out ahead of her. For a moment, they were alone in the quiet room. He stood, unsure what to say. "Thank you," he managed. She met his eyes, her own weary but clear. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This is just the beginning." "I know." He watched her walk out without another word, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan let out a long breath and sank back into the chair. He felt as though he'd just been through a war he hadn't trained for. But under the exhaustion was a thin, determined thread of hope. He would prove himself, one day at a time. When he stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead made everything look stark and unkind. His attorney fell into step beside him. "I'll coordinate with Miss Rivers's counsel to schedule the first supervised visit," she said briskly. "You did well in there." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, the snow was still falling, softening the hard edges of the world. He zipped his coat and turned up the collar, drawing a breath that felt like the first clean air in months. He'd lost so much time, but this was how he would begin to reclaim it. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with steady, consistent presence. One day, he hoped his children would believe he hadn't simply shown up because the truth had become inconvenient to ignore. He wanted them to know he'd shown up because he couldn't bear not to. The ride back to the city was quiet. He didn't check his phone, though it vibrated incessantly with messages from the board, from Vivienne, from the PR team demanding statements. He ignored them all. As the car rolled along the bridge, the skyline emerged through the swirling snow, every light a reminder of the life he'd built. Once, it had seemed like proof he'd made all the right choices. Now, it looked like evidence of how completely he'd lost himself. He thought of Mason's solemn eyes, of Mia's tentative smile, of Max hiding behind his siblings. They didn't know yet who he was in all his failures and inadequacies. They only knew he was the man who hadn't been there. But if he did this right, maybe someday they would also know he was the man who came back, who stayed. The car pulled up in front of the penthouse building, but he didn't move to get out. He sat there, staring up at the glass tower that had once felt like the pinnacle of everything he'd achieved. It looked cold now, sterile, a monument to a version of himself he no longer believed in. He thought of Camille's voice, quiet but steady. "You don't get to play the devoted father in public and disappear again." He wouldn't. He couldn't. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the promise settle over him like a second skin. One day at a time. One visit at a time. That was how he would begin to mend what he'd broken. The car idled at the curb as he reached for his phone. He scrolled past the messages from the board and the alerts from the press, stopping only when he found the contact he'd added back into his phone last night. "Camille." He typed out a short message, reading it twice before hitting send. "Thank you for today. I'll see you next week." He didn't expect a reply, and none came. But it felt right, anyway. A small first step in a long road he was finally ready to walk. The first supervised visit took place in the community center playroom, a bright space full of low tables and bins of toys and books. The social worker, a kind woman named Marla, greeted Ethan at the door with a reassuring smile, though he could tell she was assessing him the way she might any stranger stepping into a child's life. He didn't blame her. He felt like an imposter in his own skin, uncertain how to be here, how to measure up to all the things he had failed to be for so long. Camille arrived a few minutes later, the kids clustered around her like small satellites. Mason came first, eyeing Ethan warily as he clutched a battered red truck to his chest. Mia peeked out from behind her mother's hip, her wide brown eyes flicking to Ethan's face, then darting away. Max hung back, his thumb hooked in the collar of Camille's coat. Ethan swallowed around the tightness in his throat. These were his children, his blood, his history, and he felt as though he were meeting them for the first time. Camille crouched to kiss each of them before she straightened and met his gaze. Her expression was steady, neither encouraging nor discouraging, just clear. This was up to him. He nodded, forcing a thin smile, and stepped forward. "Hi," he said, his voice rough. "I'm glad to see you again." Mason shifted from foot to foot. Mia studied her shoes. Only Max seemed willing to meet his eyes, though even he looked unsure what to make of this man who'd appeared out of nowhere to claim a title he'd never earned. Marla cleared her throat softly. "Why don't you all come in and get settled?" she suggested, her voice bright. Ethan followed them into the playroom, feeling the air thicken with unspoken questions. He knelt by a low table and glanced at the bins of wooden blocks and puzzles. "Would you guys like to build something together?" he asked, hoping his voice didn't betray how badly his hands were trembling. Mason shrugged without looking at him. Mia edged closer to her brother, her small hand curling in the fabric of his sweater. But Max stepped forward, studying Ethan with that same serious gaze that made something in Ethan's chest ache. "Are you really our dad?" Max asked, his voice high and clear in the quiet room. The question struck him like a physical blow. He drew a slow breath and nodded. "I am," he said softly. "I know it probably feels strange. I haven't been here. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Max considered this for a long moment before he nodded once, solemn as a judge. Then he turned and sat cross-legged at the table, pulling the bin of blocks toward him. Ethan waited, not wanting to force anything, and was relieved beyond measure when Mia slipped into the chair beside her brother. Mason stood a moment longer, his truck clutched so tightly Ethan worried the plastic might crack, before he finally sank into the chair opposite Ethan. They didn't speak as they began to stack the blocks into haphazard towers, the quiet punctuated only by the soft clatter of wood and Marla's gentle encouragement from the corner of the room. But gradually the tension began to ease, like a taut wire loosening one careful inch at a time. Max built a crooked castle and looked up at Ethan expectantly. "Is it good?" he asked. Ethan swallowed the sudden burn in his throat. "It's amazing," he said honestly. Max's grin was shy but unmistakable, and when Mia giggled, some of the tightness in Ethan's chest eased. He didn't dare look at Camille, who was sitting just outside the open doorway with her hands folded in her lap. He knew if he met her eyes, he'd lose whatever fragile composure he'd managed to assemble. Instead, he focused on the small, astonishing reality in front of him. 3 children who were slowly, cautiously letting him in. When the hour was up, Marla gave them a 10-minute warning. Mason stiffened immediately, his small jaw tightening as he looked at Camille hovering in the doorway. "Do we have to leave?" he demanded, his voice sharp with something like panic. Camille's expression softened, and she crouched to his level. "We'll come back, sweetheart," she said gently. "Remember? We talked about this." Mason didn't look convinced. He glared at Ethan, his eyes fierce. "Are you going to disappear again?" The question landed with brutal accuracy. Ethan felt the heat rise in his face, but he didn't look away. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. Even if I can't see you every day, I'll always come back, I promise." Mason searched his face, looking for any crack in the words. After a long moment, he nodded, though he didn't look happy about it. Max picked up his truck and tucked it under his arm before slipping his free hand into Ethan's. The simple trust of the gesture made his throat tighten so hard he couldn't speak. Mia pressed a small, folded piece of paper into his palm. "It's a drawing," she whispered. "Of you." He looked down, blinking back the sting in his eyes as he unfolded the paper. A stick figure with dark hair and a blue shirt stood beside 3 smaller figures, all holding hands under a crooked yellow sun. He couldn't remember the last time anything had mattered so much. He cleared his throat and managed to smile. "Thank you," he whispered. "It's beautiful." When they left, the playroom felt unbearably quiet. Ethan stayed where he was, Mia's drawing trembling in his hands. Marla touched his shoulder gently. "That was a good first visit," she said, her voice kind. "You did well." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. As he walked out to the parking lot, the cold air felt almost cleansing. He stood for a long moment, the breath fogging in front of him, before he finally slid into the car and shut the door. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he took out his phone and opened a blank note. He began typing a list. Ideas for the next visit, questions he wanted to ask Camille about their routines, reminders of the things each of them had said. He read the list twice, his heart settling into something that felt almost like purpose. Later that evening, he sat in the small apartment he'd rented across the city, the drawing propped on the kitchen counter where he could see it. He knew he would have to return to work eventually, to the board meetings and the investors and the relentless expectations he'd built around himself. But for now, this mattered more. The next visit came sooner than he expected. Camille brought them to the same community center, though this time, she lingered in the doorway a moment longer, as if reassuring herself she wasn't making a mistake. Mason was still wary, but Max barreled into the playroom ahead of everyone, brandishing a book he wanted Ethan to read. Maya slipped her hand into his without hesitation. For a little while, it almost felt normal. Ethan read aloud, stumbling over the silly rhymes as the kids dissolved into giggles. Mason watched with guarded suspicion, but when Ethan finally looked up, he thought he saw something in his son's face, something softer than resentment. When the hour was up again, Mason didn't ask if he was going to disappear. He only nodded, clutching his truck to his chest, and said, "See you next time." The words lodged in Ethan's heart, bright and unsteady. Later that night, as he lay in the unfamiliar darkness of the apartment, he replayed every detail. The warmth of Max's hand, Mia's shy smile, the way Mason's voice had lost a little of its edge. He thought about Camille too, about the way she'd watched him from the doorway, her expression wary but not closed. He knew it would take time, that he would have to show up again and again, proving with every visit that he was no longer the man who had walked away. But for the first time, he believed it was possible. He believed he could become someone worthy of their trust. He turned over, pulling the blanket higher around his shoulders, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, sleep came easily. When he woke in the morning, he lay still for a long moment, the early light painting the ceiling in pale bands of gold. He felt something in his chest that had been absent for so long, he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. And though he knew he hadn't earned it yet, he was ready to try. The morning of the press conference dawned cold and clear, the kind of brittle winter day that made the city look deceptively beautiful. Ethan stood at the window of the conference room on the 29th floor of his company's headquarters, watching snowflakes drift past the glass in slow, silent spirals. The skyline beyond looked serene, but inside the building, tension was simmering just beneath the surface. He could feel it in the way his executive team spoke in clipped sentences, in the hurried footsteps of assistants ferrying folders from one office to another. Vivienne had been in the building since dawn. He'd heard her voice before he ever saw her, sharp, purposeful, commanding. She was in damage control mode, and she was good at it. For years, he'd admired that about her, the way she could walk into a crisis and turn it into an opportunity. But today, as he watched the flurry of preparation, he felt nothing but a quiet dread. He'd already tried to tell her he didn't want this. The stage-managed apology, the carefully crafted talking points, the script that turned his children into a headline. She hadn't listened. She'd only looked at him with that cool, assessing gaze and said, "You can't let this control the narrative. If you do, you'll never get it back." He'd once believed that too. That you could steer perception if you were relentless enough, polished enough, ruthless enough. But he was starting to see how hollow that thinking had become. Some truths couldn't be spun, some stories couldn't be controlled, and some moments demanded honesty, no matter how much it cost you. He heard the door open behind him, and Vivienne's perfume drifted into the room before her voice did. "You're going to be late," she said, her heels tapping across the marble floor. "They're setting up in the main hall." Ethan didn't turn. "I'm not going." There was a pause, just long enough for him to imagine the expression on her face. "Excuse me?" He drew a slow breath, his eyes still on the drifting snow. "I'm not going," he repeated. "I told you, I'm not doing this." Her footsteps stopped behind him. When she spoke again, her voice was low and dangerous. "You don't have a choice. If you don't get in front of this, you'll lose control of the story. The board is already—" "I don't care about the board," he said, turning finally to look at her. "I don't care about the story. I care about my kids." Vivienne's mouth flattened. "Do you think this is about you playing hero? About you standing up there and making some grand confession? This is about protecting everything you've built." He shook his head. "No, this is about protecting them. And I'm not going to stand in front of a room full of reporters and pretend that this is just another inconvenience to be managed." You're being sentimental, she snapped. You can't afford to be. For once, I think I can, he said quietly. She stared at him, her eyes bright with something he couldn't quite name. Anger, disappointment, maybe fear. So what? You're just going to walk away from all of it? No, he said. I'm going to walk toward something better. Her laugh was brittle. And what exactly is that, Ethan? Being a part-time father to kids you don't even know? Chasing some illusion of redemption? Maybe, he admitted, but it's still better than standing here pretending I'm proud of who I've become. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else, something that would slice him down to the bone. But instead, she just pressed her lips together, shook her head, and turned away. He watched her walk out of the conference room without another word, her heels clicking briskly against the floor. The door closed behind her with a soft thud that sounded, to him, like the end of something he couldn't quite name. He didn't wait to see what she would do next. He picked up his coat from the back of a chair and walked out of the building without speaking to anyone. The receptionist looked up in surprise, her mouth opening as if to call after him. But he kept going, his steps steady, even as adrenaline surged in his veins. Outside, the cold hit him like a slap, but it felt bracing, clarifying. He pulled in a deep breath, tasting the snow in the air. Then he took out his phone and called Camille. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. Hello? I'm sorry to call without notice, he said, trying to keep his voice even. I need to see you. There was a pause. Is everything all right? No, he admitted, but I'm trying to make it right. Another silence, longer this time. Then she sighed. Where are you? Outside my office, he said. I can come to you. She was quiet for a moment before she said, Meet me at the park. The one near the library. I'll be there, he said. The line went dead, but he felt lighter than he had in weeks. He walked to the park instead of hailing a car, letting the cold burn the edges of his thoughts clean. When he reached the gates, he saw her immediately, standing near the playground in a navy coat, her hands tucked into her pockets. She looked tired, but she looked like herself, and somehow that steadied him more than anything else could have. He crossed the snow-dusted grass toward her. Thank you for meeting me, he said quietly. I didn't know if I should, she admitted. You sounded upset. I am, he said, but not with you. She studied him for a moment, her breath misting in the cold air. What happened? They're holding a press conference, he said. Vivienne wants me to stand there and pretend this is all just another PR problem, like my kids are a liability to be managed. Camille's jaw tightened. And you? I walked out, he said. I couldn't do it. Her eyes softened, though her voice stayed level. That must have cost you. Probably, he said with a short, humorless laugh. But it felt like the first honest thing I've done in years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Children shrieked on the playground behind them, their laughter bright in the cold morning. He watched the way Camille's gaze drifted toward the sound, something wistful in her expression. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be a father, but I'm trying. I know you are, she said softly. He swallowed. I don't expect you to trust me overnight. No, she agreed, but you're here. That counts for something. He felt something ease in his chest just a little. Do they know I'm coming today? She shook her head. I didn't want to promise anything I couldn't deliver. Will you tell them? He asked. That I came to see you first? That I'm not going to hide them behind a press release? Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close. I'll tell them. He nodded, feeling unsteady with relief. Thank you. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment he felt as though she saw past every mistake he'd made. You have a lot to prove, she said quietly. To them. To yourself. I know, he said, but I'm ready. They stood in silence, the snow drifting around them in lazy spirals. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. When he left the park, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt raw and scared and more human than he had in years. He turned his phone back on, ignoring the flood of messages waiting for him. Instead, he scrolled to the picture Mia had drawn and set it as his background, a small reminder of what mattered. As he walked through the cold, he realized he didn't care what the investors thought or how many headlines would dissect his choices. He was done performing. He was ready to build something real, something honest, something worth the pain of starting over. And for the first time, he believed he might actually have the courage to do it. Spring came slowly that year, as if the city itself had grown tired of pretending it knew how to warm again after the long, brutal winter. The snow lingered in dirty heaps at the curb, and the trees remained bare for weeks past their usual bloom. But each morning when Ethan woke, he felt something in his chest that hadn't been there the year before. A quiet, persistent hope that maybe, after all the damage he had caused, there was still time to mend what mattered most. He had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined in the days when he measured his worth in quarterly earnings and press coverage. Twice a week, he met Camille and the kids at the community center, or the park, or sometimes the library. The visits were still supervised, but the social worker had taken to sitting near the door, half reading her paperwork, instead of hovering close by. Mason remained cautious, but no longer openly hostile. Mia had begun to chatter in soft, shy bursts, her dark eyes bright when she told him about her favorite books or the doll she kept tucked under her pillow. And Max had become the small anchor in those hours, bold enough to clamber into Ethan's lap without asking, to hold his hand without hesitation, to beam up at him like he was someone safe. Camille never stayed far, though she didn't interfere. She watched from a bench, her expression careful but no longer closed. He had learned to read the small shifts in her face, the subtle easing of tension when she heard Mia laugh, the quiet relief when Mason accepted help with his math homework instead of pushing Ethan away. He knew it would take a long time for trust to take root, but he had stopped thinking in terms of quick fixes. Everything worthwhile needed patience, and he was finally ready to give it. On a warm April afternoon, they met in the small park a few blocks from Camille's house. The last of the ice had melted, leaving the grass damp and fresh-smelling. Ethan arrived early and sat on the picnic table, feeling something close to nervousness even after all these visits. When he heard their voices approaching, he stood without thinking, and a moment later, Max came pelting across the grass, a grin splitting his face. "You're here," Max yelled, skidding to a stop against Ethan's leg. "Mom said maybe you'd come early." Ethan crouched and ruffled his hair, smiling. "I wanted to see you as long as I could." Mason came next, walking more slowly, a soccer ball tucked under his arm. He nodded at Ethan, and though the gesture was small, it felt monumental. Mia trailed after, clutching a small plastic bag. "What have you got there?" Ethan asked, nodding to her hand. Mia bit her lip, her cheeks pink. "Cookies. We made them." He felt his heart go tight. "For me?" "For everybody," she corrected, but when she held out the bag, he saw she had labeled it in careful, crooked letters, "To Dad." Camille arrived then, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes meeting his with something gentler than he'd ever expected to see again. She lifted a hand in greeting, and for a moment he thought about how different this felt from those first painful meetings. How different he felt, standing here with no pretense left to hide behind. They spent the afternoon on the grass. Max insisted on climbing onto Ethan's shoulders, shrieking when Mason tried to tag him with the soccer ball. Mia sat beside Camille, watching them with a look of cautious joy that made Ethan's throat burn. Every so often, Camille glanced at him and smiled, tentative but real, and he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to deserve it. When the shadows began to stretch long across the field, Camille rose and brushed the grass from her jeans. "It's time to head home," she called. Max groaned. "But it's still light out." Mason heaved the soccer ball at Ethan, who caught it without thinking. "Can you come again tomorrow?" Mason asked, and the simplicity of the question cracked something in Ethan's chest wide open. "I have work in the morning," he said softly, "but I can come in the afternoon if it's okay with your mom." Camille nodded, her gaze steady. "That's fine." Mia slipped her hand into his. "We could finish the story you were reading," she whispered. "I'd love that," he said, and he meant it more than he knew how to say. They walked to Camille's car together, the kids darting ahead to climb into their seats. Camille lingered beside the door, her keys in hand, studying him with an unreadable expression. "You're really doing it?" she said finally. "Showing up." He swallowed, wishing there was a way to explain how much it mattered that she noticed. "I told you I would." "I know," she said. For a moment she looked as though she might say something else, But she only nodded and climbed in behind the wheel. As he watched them drive away, he felt the ache of all the years he'd lost. But for once, the regret didn't hollow him out completely. It just reminded him to be grateful for every second he had left. The next week, his attorney called to confirm that the court had approved the updated custody agreement. The supervised visits would continue for a few more months, but after that, they could transition to unsupervised time if Camille agreed. When he hung up, Ethan stood for a long moment in his silent apartment, absorbing what it meant. He had not earned back his place in their lives completely, but he had earned the right to try. That evening, he drove to Camille's house, his palms damp on the steering wheel. He had called ahead, and she'd said it was fine to come by for dinner. When she opened the door, the kids tumbled around her in a tangle of excitement and questions. "Did you bring the book?" Mia demanded. "It's in the car," he said, laughing as Max grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. Camille closed the door behind him, her eyes meeting his in the dim hallway. "You don't have to keep proving yourself every minute," she said quietly. "You're here. That counts." He nodded, feeling something lift from his shoulders. "Thank you." Dinner was simple. Spaghetti and salad, the kind of meal that tasted better for being shared. Mia perched beside him, showing him her drawings. Max narrated an elaborate story about the imaginary kingdom he was building with Legos. Mason listened without speaking, but when Ethan offered to help with homework after they ate, he didn't say no. Later, when the kids had drifted into the living room, Camille stood at the sink washing dishes. Ethan moved beside her to dry, their hands bumping now and then. The domesticity of it made his chest ache in ways he couldn't quite name. "You don't have to do this," she said without looking up. "I want to," he said, and he meant it. She was quiet for a moment, rinsing a plate before she set it aside. "You're different," she said finally. "I don't know if it will last, but you're different." He swallowed. "I hope so." When she did look up, her eyes were softer than he'd ever expected. "So do I." They finished in silence, and when he stepped into the living room, Mason surprised him by scooting over on the couch to make space. Ethan sat carefully, the book Mia had given him open on his knee. Max crawled into his lap without hesitation, and Mia leaned her head on his arm. Mason didn't touch him, but he didn't move away either, and Ethan took that as the gift it was. He began to read, his voice a little rough at first, then steadying as the words carried them all somewhere simpler, safer. He read until Max's eyelids drooped and Mia's breathing grew slow and even. Mason stayed awake, his gaze fixed on the page, and when Ethan finished, he looked up and met Ethan's eyes. "Will you be here next week?" Mason asked, his voice small. Ethan nodded. "Every week, as long as you'll let me." Mason didn't smile, but he nodded, and that was enough. Camille appeared in the doorway, her arms folded loosely. "I think it's bedtime," she said gently. The kids stirred, grumbling, but none of them argued. Ethan helped them gather their things, and when he stepped out onto the porch, the night air felt less cold than he remembered. Camille stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the warm light behind her. "Good night," she said softly. "Good night," he said. "And thank you." "For what?" "For letting me try." She was quiet a moment. Then she nodded, and he saw something in her eyes that looked like the beginning of forgiveness. When he walked to his car, he felt something unfamiliar loosening in his chest. It wasn't triumph or relief or even certainty. It was the quiet understanding that love wasn't something you earned in a single grand gesture. It was something you built one steady day at a time. He drove home with the windows cracked, the spring air cool on his face, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel like he was running from anything at all. In the end, this story is not about a wealthy CEO reclaiming his public image or saving face. It's about something much quieter and far more important. It's about the courage to admit when you were wrong and the humility it takes to start over. Ethan spent years chasing success, believing that prestige and power would fill the emptiness he carried inside. But true fulfillment never came from the headlines or the applause. It came from showing up, messy, imperfect, and real, for the people who needed him most. The most valuable lesson here is that redemption is never instant. It isn't earned with a single apology or a grand gesture. It's earned day by day with small acts of presence and honesty. No matter how much time has been lost, it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to become the person you wish you had been all along. Forgiveness, too, is not something you can demand. It grows in the quiet spaces between bedtime stories, shared meals, and the simple promise to keep showing up. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You only have to be willing to try, again and again. Thank you so much for staying with this story to the very end. I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories about redemption, love, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means so much, and I can't wait to share more with you soon.